closely at the world around you, and you run into a theological paradox. It is difficult to reconcile a world filled with suffering and strict physical limitations with the concept of a perfect, all-loving creator. Nearly 2,000 years ago, a group of early Christians embraced a radical alternative. They viewed the physical universe as a cosmic accident, a flawed prison built by ignorant, tyrannical entities known as the rulers or archons. This suppressed cosmic history was hidden from humanity for millennia. It stayed buried until a massive cache of forbidden texts was discovered in the Egyptian desert in 1945. Among these documents is a scripture called The Reality of the Rulers, which meticulously details the catastrophic error that birthed these malevolent entities. To understand our imprisonment in physical bodies, we have to look past the material universe entirely. We have to go back to a time before time to witness the ultimate cosmic mistake. These ancient texts describe the original state of existence as the pleroma, or the fullness. This is a perfect pre-material spiritual realm inhabited by divine emanations called eons. One of these eons is Sophia, the embodiment of wisdom. The texts explain that Sophia made a fatal decision. She attempted to create offspring entirely on her own, bypassing her masculine counterpart and fracturing the strict cosmic order. This unauthorized act caused a severe rupture. The resulting emanation was cast outside the boundaries of the perfect spiritual realm, falling into a dark shadow of matter. In Gnostic cosmology, unilateral desire without balance cannot produce perfection. It inevitably spawns anomalies and chaos. The physical manifestation of Sophia's mistake was grotesque. She gave birth to an aborted, hermaphroditic entity with a lion's face, which she named Yaldabaoth, the demiurge. Horrified and deeply ashamed by her creation, Sophia cast Yaldabaoth far away. She hid him inside a luminous cloud, ensuring that none of the other immortal beings could see his twisted form. Yaldabaoth awoke inside this isolated abyss. Surrounded only by darkness and completely cut off from the pleroma, he possessed no knowledge of his mother or the perfect realm above him. He assumed he was entirely alone. From this isolation came his ultimate delusion. Sitting on his throne, Yaldabaoth uttered a blasphemous declaration. "I am God, and there is none beside me." Isolation, blindness, and extreme cosmic arrogance drive this architect, leaving the physical universe devoid of divine love or intention. To manage this new realm of material chaos, Yaldabaoth began generating offspring molded in his own flawed image. These are the archons. Yaldabaoth sits at the center of the archon hierarchy, commanding 7 kings over the heavens, 5 underworld rulers, and 360 angelic beings. These archons act as cosmic wardens, constructing planetary spheres and strict physical laws to trap spiritual elements. Modern scholars, like historian Elaine Pagels, point out that these texts were essentially decoding the spiritual forces of evil that early Christian letters warned about. These entities function as cosmic middle management, ignorant bureaucrats who enforce order through fear and rigid restriction. Seeking a docile slave to serve in their counterfeit material world, the archons plotted to create a human being out of earthly soil. They called him Adam. They molded the clay, but their plot failed. The physical form remained completely lifeless on the ground because the archons themselves possessed no true spiritual, life-giving power. Higher divine forces used this weakness against them, tricking Yaldabaoth into blowing his own breath into Adam's face. By doing this, the demiurge inadvertently transferred the stolen divine light he had inherited from Sophia directly into the clay. The consequence was immediate. Adam awakened, but he was not the docile slave they intended. He suddenly possessed a spiritual intellect and a power that vastly outranked his tyrannical creators. The archons built this material prison, but their own ignorance transferred the root of truth into humanity. By understanding exactly how these rulers were created, humanity acquires gnosis, the secret knowledge required to finally break their system and escape. In December 1945, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging for sabak, a nitrogen-rich soil used as fertilizer, near the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliffs in Upper Egypt. His tool struck a buried clay jar. Expecting gold, he smashed it open, finding 13 leather-bound papyrus books sealed away for 16 centuries. Rumors of the discovery eventually drew the attention of representatives connected to the Vatican. In the early 1950s, they reportedly offered the equivalent of over $2 million to place these texts under proper ecclesiastical protection. The attempt to buy and hide the library failed. These 13 books were being treated as a liability by the world's most powerful religious institution, evidence of a story that they had spent nearly 2,000 years trying to keep out of sight. For most of history, the story of early Christianity was written exclusively by the group that won. They decided which books stayed in the Bible and which ones were destroyed. Church fathers like Irenaeus built their legacies by aggressively condemning alternative beliefs. To them, anyone who interpreted the life of Jesus differently was a heretic, and their writings were ordered to be burned. But the Nag Hammadi discovery proved that early Christianity was actually a chaotic galaxy of competing ideas. These manuscripts, written in ancient Coptic, preserve the voices of those who were silenced. The 52 texts found in that jar revealed a version of the faith so different that it required 1,600 years of total erasure to keep it from the public eye. One of the most famous books in the collection is the Gospel of Thomas. It skips the miracles entirely. No virgin birth, no walking on water, and no crucifixion or resurrection narratives. Instead, it defines salvation as gnosis, direct internal experience. In this tradition, divine knowledge comes through a transformative awakening of the self, rather than an intellectual acceptance of a creed. The text contains sayings that focus on self-reliance, like the famous warning, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." This shift inward removed the need for any external middleman. If the divine spark is already within the individual, the entire framework of priests, bishops, and church buildings becomes irrelevant. By moving the source of authority from a physical institution to the human heart, Gnosis offered a spiritual path that the established church could not control. These ideas grew in the intellectual center of Alexandria, where scholars blended Egyptian traditions with Greek philosophy to investigate the universe. They eventually concluded that the material world is not the creation of a loving God, but is actually a flawed prison designed to keep the spirit trapped in a cycle of ignorance. At the center is the demiurge, an arrogant deity who constructed the physical grid we inhabit, below the true light. Humanity contains a divine spark stuck within his systems. Thus, the authorities governing this world, the empire and church, are just extensions of that prison. This wasn't just a different way to pray. It was a philosophy that stripped all legitimacy from the state and the church, offering a spiritual rationale for refusing to obey any earthly master. Facing an intellectual insurgency that undermined its very structure, the early Orthodox Church moved to centralize its power. They responded by creating a rigid biblical canon and an uncompromising vertical hierarchy. These were the defense mechanisms designed to ensure only one version of Christianity could be taught. By 367 AD, bishops were issuing orders to hunt down and burn any books that didn't fit the approved list. This was the moment heresy became a crime, and the physical evidence of Gnostic thought was nearly wiped from the map. The Gnostic movement essentially acted as the anvil upon which the Church hammered out its final authoritarian form. Despite the massive effort to destroy these ideas, a few practitioners buried their books in clay jars, ensuring the dissenters' voices survived. When these jars were opened in 1945, they proved that what we call orthodoxy was simply the group that had the political power to win. Today, as people grow increasingly skeptical of institutional control, the Gnostic message feels unexpectedly modern. It reminds us that sometimes the most disruptive act in history is looking inward to find the truth for ourselves. In 1944, a Polish Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin needed a new word to describe the deliberate destruction of a people. He combined Greek and Latin to give us genocide. But as he researched the mechanics of human eradication, he looked past the 20th century. He looked to a forgotten 13th century war in southern France. In the early 1200s, the region known as the Languedoc was remarkably different from the rest of Europe. It was highly urbanized, it was deeply wealthy, and comparatively tolerant. The people here didn't even speak French. They spoke Occitan, a language closer to Catalan, and operated under a patchwork of independent local lords. This open atmosphere allowed a religious movement to take root, the Cathars. They were Christian dualists. They believed the universe was split down the middle. There was a good God who created pure spirit, and a separate evil God who created the physical, material world. This diagram illustrates the specific threat this theology posed to the establishment. If everything physical was evil, that included human bodies, land, and money. The Cathars called this evil creator Rex Mundi, or King of the World. And when they looked at the Catholic Church, with its massive land holdings, ornate cathedrals, and wealthy priests, they concluded the Pope was acting as an agent of the devil. The Cathars were telling tens of thousands of followers that the tithes they paid to Rome were funding evil. This attacked the revenue and authority of the medieval church, stripping the Vatican of its legitimacy among a massive swath of the European population. Pope Innocent III realized the movement was spreading fast. He initially tried sending delegations of monks to preach in the Languedoc and win the population. But local nobles actively protected the Cathar leaders. The diplomats were ignored, laughed at, or chased out of town. Then, in January 1208, the Pope's senior representative in the region, Pierre de Castelnau, met with the powerful Count of Toulouse. The meeting went terribly. The next morning, a knight loyal to the Count murdered Castelnau. Innocent III reacted with overwhelming force. He declared a holy crusade. Up until this moment, crusading was a military tool deployed almost exclusively against Muslims in the Middle East. Turning that machinery inward against fellow European Christians was a drastic escalation. To raise an army quickly, the Pope offered the same spiritual rewards granted for fighting in the Holy Land, plus a highly lucrative physical bonus. Any northern French nobleman willing to march south and take up arms was legally authorized to seize the lands of the heretics for themselves. By tying eternal salvation to real estate, the Pope converted religious fervor into a legal mandate for conquest. A spiritual dispute over theology became a state-sanctioned land grab, setting the stage for total war. By the summer of 1209, an army of roughly 10,000 crusaders had marched south. Their first major target was Béziers, a fortified city known to harbor a strong Cathar community alongside a large Catholic population. When the city fell, the crusaders didn't bother sorting the believers from the heretics. They slaughtered the entire population, men, women, and children. The papal legate directing the army allegedly gave a chilling order: "Kill them all. God will know his own." As the army marched on, they began targeting the Cathar spiritual leaders, known as perfects. When captured, these leaders were given a choice to recant their beliefs. When they refused, the crusaders burned them alive en masse. At heavily fortified towns like Minerve and Termes, prolonged sieges ended with hundreds of Cathars willingly walking into massive pyres, rather than surrendering their faith. Fire and mass execution were now the official military strategies. The campaign had shed its original goal of saving souls. The Catholic establishment was no longer trying to persuade or convert the people of the Languedoc. They were trying to physically exterminate them. This map illustrates how the Crusades succumbed to deep mission creep. Under a minor French nobleman named Simon de Montfort, the religious war turned into territorial conquest. Northern lords were systematically attacking and absorbing castles from southern nobles, regardless of whether they were actually Cathars. This naked aggression provoked a massive backlash. By 1216, the surviving Occitan lords allied with the King of Aragon to defend their homelands. The south mounted a fierce, organized military resistance against the invading crusaders. The momentum violently shifted in 1218 during the siege of Toulouse. While attempting to fend off a counterattack, Simon de Montfort was struck and killed by a heavy stone. According to contemporary accounts, the defensive artillery that crushed him was operated by the women and girls of the city. Without Montfort, the crusade bogged down into a messy, decades-long guerrilla war. As the crusaders fortified captured cities, the surviving Cathars retreated from public life entirely, practicing their faith in secret and relying on a clandestine network of sympathetic locals. The Pope had unleashed armies, he had destroyed cities, and burned hundreds alive. But military force, no matter how brutal or prolonged, proved too blunt an instrument to destroy a deeply held, clandestine belief system. The open warfare finally ended in 1229 with the Treaty of Paris. The military crusade was over, and the French crown walked away with a massive territorial victory, pulling the Languedoc permanently under its control. But the Church faced a terrifying realization. Armies can conquer cities, redraw borders, and exact tribute. They cannot reach into the minds of the populace to root out a hidden belief. To finish the job, the Vatican authorized the newly formed Dominican order to create the medieval Inquisition, a bureaucratic system designed to hunt down hidden adherents. Inquisitors moved from town to town, setting up tribunals. They meticulously recorded testimonies, cross-referenced confessions, and used localized interrogations and executions to map the underground Cathar network. By the early 1300s, this systematic machinery had eradicated the movement completely. The physical and cultural landscape of the South was erased right along with the theology. The unique, tolerant society of the Languedoc and its Occitan language were permanently absorbed into the Kingdom of France. Raphael Lemaitre identified this crusade as the moment institutionalized power developed the administrative tools to target and remove a population. By standardizing investigations, property seizures, and legal erasure, the Church created a structural model for cultural destruction that modern states would later adopt and refine. If you ask how the Christian Bible came together, you will likely hear a story about the Roman Emperor Constantine. The popular legend says he gathered a room full of bishops and ordered them to compile a single sacred book by imperial decree. That specific room is usually identified as the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. But historical records from that gathering show that these bishops were focused on other theological disputes. They didn't actually debate or finalize a list of biblical books. For the first 300 years of Christianity, there was no single, universally agreed-upon Bible. Instead, there was a decentralized network of communities spread across the Mediterranean, trading and copying dozens of different scrolls. The reading lists varied wildly from city to city. You would find the familiar Gospels of Matthew and John circulating, alongside texts that are largely forgotten today, like the Acts of Paul or the Gospel of the Hebrews. As the Christian movement expanded, this lack of a defined boundary became a vulnerability. Without a central list, different regions were beginning to read and believe vastly different things. Different factions began to use this fluidity to their advantage. In the 2nd century, the teacher Marcion stripped away the Old Testament and edited the Gospels to fit his specific agenda, while Gnostic groups produced their own treatises claiming to be secret apostolic teachings. Early church leaders battled the physical reality of these texts. They were handmade, easily fragmented, and highly vulnerable to unauthorized changes. Then came the problem of pseudepigrapha, authors attaching an apostle's name to new texts for instant authority. Looking at a parchment like this, there was no way to visually verify if the words were genuine. To protect their teachings, bishops began calling for a canon, a Greek word that literally means a measuring stick. They needed a standard to determine which texts were authentic and which were not. Without a way to filter out ideological forgeries, the various churches were in danger of drifting into conflicting versions of the faith, each supported by their own specific but unverified books. One of the loudest voices for a single standard was Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria. He was a veteran of theological battles who had been exiled 5 times for refusing to compromise on orthodox doctrine. In the spring of 367 AD, Athanasius drafted his 39th festal letter. These were annual messages sent to regional churches to coordinate the date of Easter, but he used this particular letter to address the confusion over Scripture. In the letter, Athanasius listed exactly 27 books that he considered divinely inspired. It is the earliest surviving document that names the exact lineup used in the modern New Testament. He specifically used the term canonized to describe them. By doing so, he formally elevated these 27 texts while warning his followers to stay away from the secret apocryphal writings favored by his rivals. Athanasius had drawn a line. The era of the open reading list was ending, replaced by a defined collection that would soon be the standard for the entire empire. This new filter meant excluding several books that had been popular for centuries, most notably the Book of Enoch. In the early centuries, Enoch was highly respected. Figures like Tertullian treated it as scripture, and the canonical Book of Jude even quotes a prophecy directly from its pages. But by 367, its content had become a problem for the church hierarchy. Enoch features a complex mythology of angels mating with humans to create giants and demons, details that Athanasius and later theologians like Augustine found too bizarre to include in the official canon. There was also a historical concern. Athanasius couldn't verify that the book had been faithfully transmitted through history, leading him to label it apocryphal, a term he used for books he believed were fabricated by heretics. By excluding a text as influential as Enoch, Athanasius proved that the 367 canon was an active attempt to purge unverified and mythological content from the Christian tradition. Athanasius didn't have the authority to dictate this list to the global church, but he didn't have to. His letter succeeded because he was articulating a consensus that was already forming among the major bishops. Over the next few decades, regional gatherings at Hippo and Carthage ratified this same 27-book list, locking in the New Testament as we know it for the Western world. However, there is a major exception. Athanasius had consecrated the first bishop of Ethiopia, Frumentius, years before this strict 27-book list was finalized and globally recognized. Because of that timing, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church inherited a broader scriptural tradition that never narrowed. Their Bible still contains the Book of Enoch, preserving a piece of the early Christian library that the rest of the world set aside. The books of the New Testament were written in the 1st century, but they spent 300 years as a loose and often contested collection. Athanasius didn't write these texts, but in 367, he provided the framework that would determine which of them survive to the present day.
We're going to explore the profound danger that early communities actually believed these writings possessed. Back then, words weren't just stories or metaphors. They were viewed as powerful, potentially perilous knowledge that required incredibly careful handling.
And the stakes here? Well, they were absolutely massive. Just listen to this severe warning from 2 Peter, chapter 3, verse 16. It outright states that misinterpreting difficult writings isn't just a simple academic mistake. No, according to this ancient perspective, getting the text wrong, distorting it, literally leads to spiritual ruin and destruction.
So, that brings us to the big question for today as we explore this ancient historical landscape. We have to ask, what actually happens when communities grapple with controversial, borderline dangerous knowledge? How do they handle texts that stretch the mind, challenge established norms, or offer secret, hidden histories of the cosmos?
Section 1. Hard to understand. If we compare historical translations handling the Apostle Paul's difficult teachings, we get a real sense of what this warning is all about. The New International Version warns that people distort these matters. But if you look at the older King James Version, it uses a much heavier word, rest. This translation cascade completely demonstrates the exact challenge the verse is warning us about, which is finding the precise meaning of complex ancient thought without breaking it.
Section 2. The danger of distortion.
The real key here is the original Greek word streblesin. When the ancient text warns about people resting or distorting scripture, it's using a word that literally means to twist with a windlass, to strain, or even to torture. It implies a forceful, aggressive perversion of the text's true meaning. It's forcing the text to say something it absolutely doesn't say, usually just to fit a personal agenda.
So who exactly is doing all this twisting? Well, the text warns that it is the ignorant and unstable. In that historical context, this meant people lacking a firm grounding in their faith or lacking proper instruction. These are the individuals most at risk of falling into this fatal error, bending deep theological concepts into something completely unrecognizable, which, as the warning goes, ultimately leads to their own destruction.
Section 3. The Book of Enoch.
If 2 Peter warned about the extreme dangers of complex scriptures, this next text is arguably one of the absolute best examples of this in all of ancient history. The Book of Enoch, often called 1 Enoch, isn't just one simple, straightforward story. It's actually a massive structure broken down into 5 distinct, independent works: the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. Ascribed by tradition to Noah's great-grandfather, these independent works were heavily edited and redacted together over a vast amount of time.
Originally written in Aramaic or Hebrew, this book didn't just pop up overnight. Its composition literally spanned centuries during the Second Temple period. The
The older sections, like the Watchers, date all the way back to 300 to 200 BC. The Book of Parables came later, around 100 BC. There was even a theory by scholar Joseph Millek dating parts of it as late as 80 to 60 to 270, though, actually scratch that, most modern scholars have pretty firmly rejected that later date.
Section 4. Watchers and the Nephilim. Now we're getting into the Book of the Watchers. It's a gripping, incredibly apocalyptic narrative that offers a wild explanation for the origin of demons and provides the cosmic backstory for why the Genesis flood was deemed morally necessary. The inciting incident of this entire cosmic rebellion is chilling. It's the exact moment the angel Semjaza, leading 199 other celestial watchers, swore an oath on the summit of Mount Hermon to descend to earth and take human wives. They knew it was a massive transgression, so they bound themselves together with mutual curses. But they definitely didn't just take wives. Right on the heels of that, we see another fallen angel, Azazel, radically accelerating human civilization by teaching humanity forbidden secret arts. He taught them the forging of weapons of war, swords and shields, along with the use of cosmetics, antimony, and astrology. The text essentially claims this forbidden knowledge is what led mankind completely astray.
And the terrifying result of this angelic rebellion? The offspring of the Watchers and human women were the Nephilim. The text describes them as massive giants, 300 ells tall, who quickly consumed absolutely all the acquisitions of men. When humanity could no longer sustain them, these giants turned violently against mankind, devouring birds, beasts, reptiles, and drinking blood. It is a vision of total, absolute, earthly corruption.
Things had completely spiraled out of control. To stop this total collapse of the natural order, God essentially deployed the tactical strike team of 4 archangels in a very specific sequence. First, Uriel is sent to warn Noah of the impending flood. Second, Raphael is commanded to bind Azazel in darkness and rough rocks. Third, Gabriel is sent to turn the Nephilim against each other so they destroy themselves in battle. And finally, Michael is ordered to bind the leader, Semjaza, under the valleys of the earth.
Section 5. The Book of Parables.
Here, the text shifts gears completely. It moves away from the fallen angels and focuses intensely on eschatology, the final judgment of the world. And the language used in the Book of Parables is absolutely fascinating. It features a central protagonist described with titles like Righteous One, Chosen One, Messiah, and most crucially, Son of Man. This is actually the very first known Jewish writing to use Son of Man as a definite title for a figure sitting on the throne of glory during the final judgment. It heavily influenced early Christian theology. But guys, here's where the history gets super mysterious. The Book of Parables is completely missing from the ancient Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran, which, by the way, contained Aramaic fragments of all the other Enoch sections. It's also totally missing from the Greek translations. This glaring omission leads scholars to debate whether this section was a later addition that actually replaced an older, different text, perhaps the Book of Giants, in the original Enochic collection.
Section 6. Survival and the Canon.
So, given all those intense warnings about complex texts we saw earlier, how on earth did such a bizarre, controversial, and potentially dangerous text survive to the modern day? Well, the answer lies in geography and language. While we have mere fragments of the Book of Enoch in Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, this vast historical artifact survived entirely intact in only one place. It was translated into Ge'ez, an ancient Ethiopian language. It's really striking to see how different historical traditions handled this material. Most movements of Judaism and branches of Christianity ultimately excluded it from their canonical scripture, perhaps finding it way too obscure or dangerous, just as 2 Peter warned. But, on the other hand, it was meticulously preserved and revered as fully canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, the Eritrean Orthodox Tewahedo Church, and the Ethiopian Jewish community Beta Israel. And, despite being left out of most Western Bibles, its ancient influence was absolutely undeniable. The authors of the New Testament were clearly very familiar with it. In fact, it's directly quoted in the New Testament's Epistle of Jude, referencing a prophecy by Enoch, the seventh from Adam. It was very much a part of the intellectual air that early communities breathed.
So, we leave you with this final thought to take away from our explainer today. We started with a pretty dire warning about the dangers of twisting complex texts. Yet, despite those fears, some communities meticulously preserve the wild, cosmic visions of Enoch for millennia. It really makes you wonder, how many other ancient mysteries are hiding in plain sight, just waiting for the right minds to decode them? Thanks for joining me, and keep exploring.